A ledger concealing whispers of conspiracy. Who dares keep such secrets? Welcome to the mysterious casebook. I am your host, Alexander. Tell me, where are you listening from today? Your comments make this journey unforgettable. Let's begin. The vicarage garden had always been a place of calm, its roses climbing dutifully along the stone wall and the ivy trailing like an old friend across the vicar's study window. On that particular afternoon, however, something unsettled the air. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, was seen stooping to gather cuttings when she heard voices urgent, hushed, and not belonging to any parishioner she recognized. "They'll suspect if it's found," whispered one man, his tone clipped with anxiety. "Then it mustn't be found," another replied firmly. By the time Mrs. Clement rose and peered through the hedges, there was no one to be seen, only the soft rustle of leaves and the retreating echo of hurried footsteps. That evening, at the vicar's dinner table, the matter was mentioned casually, though it lingered in her mind. "Odd men in the garden, speaking of something hidden," she told her husband. He dismissed it as idle mischief. But when Miss Marple, a close dinner guest that night, heard the account, her blue eyes sharpened behind her knitting needles. She, unlike the vicar, knew that in a village like St. Mary Mead, whispers were seldom idle. The very next day, a peculiar stir swept the high street. Mr. Edwin Harcourt, a retired solicitor known for his solitary habits and passion for collecting rare ledgers and manuscripts, had failed to appear at his morning routine in the post office. It was said he kept meticulous notes and ledgers so precise they could shame any bank clerk. His housekeeper claimed he had been unusually restless the previous evening, pacing his library and muttering about the ledger as if it carried some dreadful weight. By afternoon, a crowd had gathered outside his ivy-draped cottage at the edge of the village. The constable stood awkwardly at the gate, clearly out of his depth, while villagers whispered in anxious knots. Perhaps he's merely unwell. Or away on business. Nonsense! He never leaves without telling Mrs. Brimley at the grocer's. Miss Marple, walking with her neat, deliberate step, paused to observe the cottage window's curtains drawn tight, with no smoke rising from the chimney. She asked the constable, in her mild way, if the doctor had been called. Moments later, the door creaked open under the constable's hesitant hand. The library was stifling, its air thick with the smell of extinguished fire and dust. Books towered in regimented stacks, and on the desk lay an open ledger, its pages scrawled with neat, obsessive figures. But Mr. Harcourt himself was not seated in his accustomed chair. He was slumped beside the hearth rug, his spectacles crooked, his face pale against the worn carpet. Lifeless. A murmur rippled through the crowd that had edged forward into the doorway. Mrs. Clement, pale as parchment, gasped. Just yesterday, men whispering in the garden, Miss Marple's needles clinked softly as she tucked them away into her bag. Her expression was gentle, but her mind was already at work. She bent to look at the open ledger on the desk, one frail hand brushing the margin where ink trailed oddly into a blot. The constable muttered, "Looks like his heart, poor man." Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice mild as ever. "Hearts do fail, yes, but sometimes they are given a little help." And as the villagers stared at the lifeless collector, Miss Marple alone noticed that a single page had been torn from the ledger, its edge ragged, its absence screaming louder than the whispers in the vicarage garden. The missing page, she knew, would be the key. But who had needed it so badly that they would silence Mr. Harcourt forever? Outside, the crowd shifted uneasily. A woman gave a stifled cry, and Miss Marple's eyes rested with curious interest on the nervous young man lingering near the back of the gathering. He alone did not seem surprised. The following morning, the entire village seemed to hum with restless chatter. In St. Mary Mead, news did not travel. It sprinted. By the time the postman reached the high street, everyone knew that poor Mr. Harcourt had been found dead in his library, spectacles still clinging askew to his nose, and a ledger open before him. At Mrs. Brimley's grocer's shop, two women leaned across baskets of onions as though the very air between them might betray their conversation. Dead, was he? Well, I can't say I'm astonished, said Mrs. Price Ridley, her voice cutting as she weighed out her sugar. A man of his age, fussing over books all day, never taking fresh air. Bound to happen. Heart attack, the constable says, replied Mrs. Brimley, though her tone suggested disbelief. But they say Miss Marple hinted it mightn't be so simple. That last remark drew a subtle hush, for in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple's hints were not dismissed lightly. Outside the shop, Miss Hartnell was already cornering the gardener's boy with a stream of questions. Did you see any strange visitors at Harcourt's house? Any motor cars late at night? Oh, don't shuffle, lad. You know something. The boy muttered about a gentleman in a bowler hat, but quickly darted away before he was made to say more. By noon, speculation had hardened into theory. Some were convinced Harcourt had enemies from his solicitor days. Cases gone sour, wills disputed, fortunes lost. Others thought of the ledgers, whispering that they held more than old numbers and dry accounts. Secrets, perhaps. Evidence. Meanwhile, Miss Marple sat quietly at the tea shop, a slice of seed cake untouched before her, listening with the faintest of smiles. Her knitting needles clinked steadily, and though she never joined the loud acclaims, she observed each speaker with the keen attention of a botanist studying wildflowers. Mrs. Clement arrived at her table, flustered, her cheeks pink from hurrying. My dear Miss Marple, I can scarcely think of anything else. You remember what I told you about the voices in the garden. And now, this dreadful business, I cannot help feeling it is all connected. Yes, Miss Marple murmured softly, as if speaking more to her wool than her companion. Voices that spoke of something hidden, and now a man found with one page missing from his ledger. One sees a pattern if one is accustomed to such things. Mrs. Clement shivered slightly. Do you believe he was murdered? Miss Marple did not answer directly. I have known cases, my dear, where a man's life was ended not with violence, but with the quietest of substances slipped into tea or wine. It is a method often chosen when appearances must be kept. And appearances, you know, are everything in small places. At the neighboring table, two elderly spinsters craned their necks, their teacups pausing midway. Gossip might be idle to most, but in St. Mary Mead it was sustenance. Later that afternoon, Inspector Graves from the county arrived, a brisk, no-nonsense man with a mustache that seemed to bristle with suspicion. He addressed the gathering of villagers outside the cottage with solemn formality. Mr. Harcourt's death is under investigation. Until further notice, I must ask that no one spread unverified stories. The statement only fueled the fire. Villagers exchanged knowing glances. Inspector Graves may have meant well, but he did not know St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple stood quietly at the edge, a small figure in her neat hat and gloves. She watched the inspector march into the cottage, his stride firm, his expression confident. He reminded her of a terrier presented with a bone determined, but perhaps too eager to gnaw without noticing what lay beneath. Her gaze drifted instead toward the nervous young man she had noticed the previous evening. He was loitering again, half hidden behind the smithy's wall, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. When their eyes met across the green, he turned abruptly and walked away, his pace just a fraction too quick to be casual. That evening, the village buzz reached its crescendo. At the inn, over pints of ale, men debated whether Harcourt's ledgers contained secret dealings or scandalous names. At the church hall, the choir whispered among themselves about an argument they had overheard weeks ago. Harcourt shouting at a stranger who had called at the cottage unannounced. And in the small parlors and kitchens, housewives whispered of fortunes hidden, debts unpaid, and a page torn that might have revealed too much. Miss Marple, sitting by her lamp in her tidy drawing-room, reflected quietly. She thought of gardens and whispers, of missing pages, and of how human beings, much like her roses, often concealed thorns beneath their most delicate petals. Then, just as the clock struck 9, the church bell clanged wildly, not for service, but for alarm. Someone had burst into the vicarage crying that the collector's housekeeper had gone missing. The tolling of the church bell brought the villagers spilling from their cottages into the lane, shawls hastily thrown over shoulders, lamps lit against the evening dark. Alarm in St. Mary Mead was rare, and when it came with a force that bound everyone together in speculation and fear. At the center of the commotion stood young Tommy Jarvis, breathless and pale. He had rushed into the vicarage with the news, and now his words were repeated from mouth to mouth with the inevitable embroidery of gossip. Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper of the late Mr. Harcourt, was missing. "I knocked and knocked, but no answer," Tommy cried, still panting from his sprint. The kitchen door was wide open, and her coat was still hanging on the peg, but she wasn't there, nor in the garden. "She's gone." Gasps followed. Mrs. Finch was as reliable as sunrise, a widow of plain habits who had served Mr. Harcourt faithfully for nearly 10 years. The thought of her vanishing without a word was as unthinkable as the church clock skipping an hour. Inspector Graves, summoned from the cottage, strode onto the green with a lantern in hand. His mustache bristled more than ever, and his voice cut firmly through the murmur. "Enough of this noise. The woman is not missing. She's absent. There's a difference. Likely she has gone to relatives or to seek comfort after yesterday's shock." Miss Marple, who had joined the gathering with her usual quiet step, raised her brows ever so slightly. "One might suppose," she said mildly, "that a woman of Mrs. Finch's character would not depart without so much as collecting her purse or shawl. People who vanish quickly often do so because haste is forced upon them." The inspector glanced at her with polite dismissal, though several villagers nodded knowingly. Miss Marple's gentle observations, so often framed as simple common sense, had a way of lodging in the mind. By morning, however, unease had hardened into alarm. Mrs. Finch had not returned. Her bed had been found unslept in, her shoes by the hearth, and her supper untouched. More troubling still, in the scullery, a basin of water had been left half-filled, as though she had broken off her tasks abruptly. Miss Marple, visiting the cottage under the pretense of offering help, moved quietly from room to room with the inspector trailing behind. Her eyes settled on a small, overlooked detail by the kitchen door. The hem of a curtain was caught oddly against the latch, as though pulled hastily and someone struggled to leave. She said nothing, only tucked the thought away. In the pantry, a loaf of bread sat sliced, but not buttered, and beside it a knife still gleamed wet, as though recently washed. Miss Marple bent, her face close, and noted faint scratches along the handle. The inspector frowned. Domestic things. Nothing of consequence. "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, "but domestic things are often the very threads that unravel mysteries if one is patient." Later that day, the villagers gathered at the green again, restless and wary. Mrs. Price Ridley, with her usual acid tongue, declared that Mrs. Finch must have known something about Mr. Harcourt's ledgers. Mark my words, she was in on it. Those books contained secrets, and she fled before the law caught her. Others disagreed, swearing Mrs. Finch was too timid to conspire. Mrs. Clement, distressed, whispered that she had once overheard Finch pleading with Harcourt about money owed to her brother. Could that have led to a quarrel? Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking in her lap, while the conversation swirled around her like threads in a tangled skein. She knew from long years that villagers rarely invented lies wholesale. Rather, truth often lay buried in exaggerations, just as a root lies beneath layers of tangled weeds. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her lamp, piecing the fragments together. She considered the ledger with its missing page, Harcourt's restless pacing before his death, the mysterious whispers in the vicarage garden, and now a housekeeper gone as though plucked from her place mid-step. Her thoughts wandered to human nature, as they so often did. People did not vanish without reason. Sometimes they ran, sometimes they were removed, and sometimes they were silenced. Just then, a knock came at her door. It was young Tommy again, pale and hesitant. "Miss Marple," he stammered. "They've found something in the woods by the mill." His voice dropped to a trembling whisper. "It's Mrs. Finch's shawl, torn and muddied." The woods near the old watermill were thick with undergrowth, the sort of place children dared each other to wander after dusk, but seldom braved alone. That night, lanterns bobbed like fireflies among the trees as Inspector Graves led a small party of villagers to the site young Tommy Jarvis had spoken of. There, snagged on a bramble bush at the edge of the path, lay Mrs. Finch's shawl. Once neat and sturdy, the wool was now torn and stained with mud, as if it had been dragged or struggled over. A broken clasp gleamed faintly in the lantern light. "There now," said Inspector Graves, kneeling to examine it. "Could have been dropped. No proof of foul play." But the villagers muttered uneasily. To lose one's shawl in the woods on a cold night seemed unlikely, and to leave it torn, unthinkable. Miss Marple bent with quiet grace, her small gloved hand hovering over the wool. "One does not part with a shawl in haste," she said softly, "especially a woman of Mrs. Finch's careful habits. Such garments are clung to, almost like a second skin. When they are left behind, it is usually not by choice." The inspector pursed his lips, or she simply stumbled and dropped it. Miss Marple's eyes glimmered in the lantern light. "Perhaps. Though I have noticed, Inspector, that shawls rarely climb onto brambles of their own accord. Someone dragged or pulled past here in some hurry." The villagers exchanged nervous glances, and the rumour mill turned faster than the old wheel of the mill itself. Mrs. Price Ridley declared that the housekeeper had surely been attacked, while Mr. Phelps, the church organist, muttered darkly about tramps and vagrants. The next morning, the shawl lay spread upon the table of the vicarage drawing-room while several villagers gathered to view it, as though its folds might give up a secret. Mrs. Clement wrung her hands. Poor Mrs. Finch. She must have been frightened half to death. "It is plain," Mrs. Hartnell interrupted firmly, "that she knew something about Mr. Harcourt's affairs. Why else vanish on the very night he died? Mark my words, she is mixed up in this business of the ledger." At that, Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with a gentle smile. "It is unwise, I think, to suppose guilt on so little evidence. Mrs. Finch, you see, is a woman who reminds me rather of a hen in the poultry yard. She scratches in her corner, content with her tasks, but will fuss dreadfully if disturbed. Hens may wander, but they rarely hatch conspiracies." Her mild observation raised a ripple of laughter, easing the tension for a moment. Yet her words lingered. Miss Marple had compared many people to hens, cats, and roses over the years, and such comparisons often struck closer to truth than one expected. That afternoon, Inspector Graves called a formal inquiry in the village hall. The villagers gathered in solemn rows, their faces lit by the dim light filtering through high windows. One by one, they were questioned. Mr. Phelps claimed to have seen a stranger loitering near Harcourt's cottage days before the death of a tall man in a dark coat with a sharp-featured face. Mrs. Price Ridley insisted she had heard raised voices from the library, though no one else corroborated it. Mrs. Clement repeated her story of overheard whispers in the vicarage garden. Through it all, Miss Marple sat quietly near the back, her hands moving steadily with her knitting. Her eyes, however, flicked now and then toward the nervous young man she had noticed before. He sat stiffly in the second row, his gaze fixed on the floor, his hands clenched too tightly on his knees. When his turn came, he gave his name as Henry Finch, nephew of the missing housekeeper. He claimed he had not visited his aunt in weeks. Yet Miss Marple noted the faint catch in his voice, the way his eyes darted to the inspector, then away, as though afraid of being caught in a net. "Strange," she murmured to herself later as she walked home under the fading evening light. "For I distinctly saw him lingering by the smithy only yesterday, watching the crowd at Harcourt's cottage." By the time the inquiry adjourned, the village had settled on its first true suspect, Henry Finch. Whispers swirled of debts, of quarrels, of nephews who might profit from old secrets. But Miss Marple, in her quiet way, was not yet convinced. She had learned through many long years that the obvious suspect was often no more than a screen behind which the real culprit waited. And as she reached her cottage gate, she noticed something small but telling. A scrap of mud on her shoe, not from the village lane but from the mill path. It carried a faint, sharp scent, unmistakably of tobacco. "Curious," she murmured, pausing with her key in hand. For Mrs. Finch never smoked a day in her life. The implication stirred in her mind as the evening deepened. Someone else had been by the mill that night. Someone who smoked and who wished very much to remain unseen. The morning after the inquiry dawned pale and misty, the kind of morning when the lanes of St. Mary Mead seemed to vanish into the fog and even the church spire looked like a ghostly sentinel. Yet the village was alive with restless talk. The suspicion that had fallen upon Henry Finch the night before had already spread, growing heavier with each telling. At the grocer's, Mrs. Price Ridley wasted no time in making her opinions known. "The boy's guilty, I'll wager," she declared, wagging a bony finger at the flour scales. "Nephews are always after their aunt's savings, and mark me, his sudden appearance in the village is no coincidence." Mrs. Brimley sniffed but said nothing. She glanced toward the corner where Miss Marple sat, quietly selecting tea leaves with her usual mild attention. Everyone in the shop knew she was listening. Everyone also knew that when Miss Marple listened, conclusions would be drawn eventually. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple set off with her walking stick for a turn about the lanes, knitting tucked neatly into her basket. She did not head for the high street, but for the mill path, where Mrs. Finch's shawl had been found. The woods were damp from the night air, the earth soft beneath her shoes. She stopped near the brambles where the torn wool had snagged. Kneeling with some effort, she peered closer. The ground here was scuffed, the mud pressed into uneven shapes, as though two sets of shoes had crossed hurriedly. One pair deep and broad, another lighter, perhaps belonging to Mrs. Finch herself. But what caught Miss Marple's eye was not the marks. It was a small, glinting object half hidden in the hedge. With delicate fingers, she lifted out a cigarette end, its paper frayed, its tobacco still carrying the pungent smell she had noticed on her shoe the night before. She held it up in the morning light, her expression calm, though her eyes sharpened with interest. Mrs. Finch did not smoke. Nor did Henry Finch, so far as she knew. This belonged to someone else, someone who had been her by the mill on the very night the housekeeper vanished. By the time she returned to the village, she found Inspector Graves at Harcourt's cottage, pacing in front of the ledger still laid open upon the library desk. He looked weary, though determined. "You seem troubled, Inspector," Miss Marple said gently as she entered, her knitting basket resting on her arm. "Troubled," he barked, though without anger. "I've got a missing woman, a dead man, and a nephew who won't answer questions straight. That's more than trouble, it's a mess." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Yes, quite a mess. And yet sometimes in such tangles one must attend to the smallest knots. A cigarette, for instance." Graves frowned. "What cigarette?" Miss Marple withdrew the stub delicately from her handkerchief. "Found by the mill hedge, very near where Mrs. Finch's shawl was left. It suggests that whoever was there may not be the same as the person we presently suspect. People who smoke often leave traces of ashes, scents, and paper. They rarely think of such things in moments of haste." The inspector's brows knitted. "Do you mean Henry Finch?" "I mean only. Miss Marple replied mildly. "That Henry Finch is not known for smoking, nor indeed was his aunt. Which begs the question, whose is it?" Before the inspector could reply, a sharp knock rattled the front door. It was Mr. Phelps, the organist, out of breath. "Inspector, you must come at once. There's been another disturbance. Someone's broken into the vicarage garden shed in the night. Tools scattered everywhere." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Graves, her eyes thoughtful. A garden shed was hardly a bank vault, yet such places often concealed more than spades and rakes. That evening, the vicarage garden was abuzz with villagers poking their noses where they scarcely belonged. The shed door hung crookedly on its hinges, the inside a jumble of overturned pots and tossed tools. But it was the vicar's spade, newly dirtied, though it had not been used in weeks, that drew Miss Marple's notice. She touched the soil clinging to the metal blade, then looked quietly toward the inspector. "One does wonder," she said softly, "why a person would trouble themselves with a spade in the dead of night." The inspector muttered, "Burying something." "Or unburying," Miss Marple replied gently, her voice low enough that only Graves could hear. As the crowd dispersed in uneasy murmurs, a scream rang out from the far corner of the garden. A maid, pale and trembling, pointed to a patch of earth where the ground had been disturbed, the soil roughly pressed down. And there, protruding just slightly from the earth, lay the broken clasp of Mrs. Finch's shawl. The scream from the vicarage garden brought villagers rushing back through the gate, lanterns raised high, their faces sharp with fear and excitement. The maid, still trembling, pointed with a shaking hand to the patch of disturbed earth. The soil had been pressed down hurriedly, and there, half hidden by clods of mud, glimmered the broken clasp of Mrs. Finch's shawl. Inspector Graves crouched quickly, brushing the dirt aside with his handkerchief. He lifted the clasp with care, turning it under the lamplight. "Same as the one torn from the shawl by the mill," he said grimly. "But how in blazes did it come to be buried here?" The villagers whispered fiercely among themselves, theories springing like weeds. Some insisted Mrs. Finch had been brought here. Others muttered of someone hiding evidence to throw suspicion. Mrs. Price Ridley, ever ready with judgment, declared loudly, "It proves what I've said all along." The Finches are in it together. First the nephew lurking about, now the aunt's belongings found in our own vicar's garden. Mrs. Clement, pale as parchment, protested. "Surely not in our garden. Why, it's unthinkable that my roses are just beside me." Miss Marple stood a little apart, her hands folded on her walking stick. She did not interrupt the inspector as he ordered the crowd back and summoned 2 constables to dig further. But her eyes were fixed intently on the soil and on the hedge that bordered the garden to the lane beyond. She noted the way the earth seemed uneven, as though trampled not once but several times. The digging continued under lamplight, the villagers hushed now, holding their breath. But beyond the broken clasp, nothing more was uncovered. No shawl, no body, no buried chest of secrets. The patch seemed to have been disturbed only for concealment of the clasp itself. Inspector Graves rose, frustrated. A trick, then. Someone planted it here to draw us off. Miss Marple's voice, gentle as ever, drifted through the murmurs. "Yes, but tricks are often more telling than truths, Inspector. For one asks, who in the village knew that this clasp was missing? Very few, I imagine, and yet it has been placed here deliberately, to be found." The inspector turned, frowning. "You mean someone's trying to mislead us?" "Or to frighten," Miss Marple said softly. "Planting such an item in the vicar's own garden is a bold move. It ensures gossip, and gossip is a weapon far sharper than any knife. Someone wishes suspicion to spread wide so that the real trail grows cold." The crowd dispersed slowly, voices low, eyes darting in suspicion at neighbor and friend alike. Miss Marple lingered behind, studying the hedge line once more. There was a faint trace of tobacco in the air, subtle but sharp, drifting from the lane. She remembered the cigarette she had found by the mill and knew the same smoker had passed this way not long before. The next day, Henry Finch found himself surrounded by curious eyes wherever he walked. At the blacksmith's, men paused in their work to watch him. At the post office, women whispered behind their gloves as he collected his letters. His face grew drawn, and his hands trembled slightly as he tried to go about ordinary errands. Miss Marple encountered him outside the green. "A fine morning, isn't it?" she said, her voice pleasant. He started, his face flushing. Yes, fine enough." "You must be weary of so many eyes upon you," Miss Marple continued mildly. "It reminds me rather of a cat in a poultry yard. Even when innocent, the poor creature cannot move without feathers flying." Henry gave a bitter laugh. "They think I know something, but I don't. I haven't seen my aunt in days. If she's gone, it's nothing to do with me." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And yet you were near the smithy on the evening of Mr. Harcourt's death, were you not? I have a keen eye, you see." His face stiffened, and for a moment she thought he might deny it. But instead he muttered, "I was there. Yes. I only wanted to hear what people were saying. That's all." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple said, her tone as light as if discussing the weather. "Still, listening in the shadows is seldom as useful as speaking plainly. Perhaps you will come to tea with me tomorrow. I make a very decent seed cake." He hesitated, then nodded quickly before hurrying away. That evening, as the lamps flickered in cottage windows and the air grew cool, Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting. Her thoughts, however, were not on stitches, but on movements, Mr. Harcourt pacing in his library, whispers in the vicarage garden, a shawl torn and muddied, a cigarette by the mill, and now a clasp planted like a seed in freshly turned soil. She knew the village well enough to recognize that such a chain was no accident. It spoke of planning, of a mind clever enough to play at misdirection, yet careless enough to leave traces. Outside, the church clock struck 10, and as the last chime faded, a knock came sudden and sharp at Miss Marple's door. On the step stood Mrs. Clement, her face white with fear. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "something dreadful. Someone's broken into the vicarage study. The ledger is gone." The vicarage was in an uproar when Miss Marple arrived, summoned by Mrs. Clement's anxious knock. Lamps had been hastily lit, casting long, restless shadows against the study walls. The vicar himself stood pale and bewildered by his desk, the drawers pulled open and papers strewn across the floor like autumn leaves. "It was here, on this very table," Mrs. Clement cried, wringing her hands. "Inspector Graves had brought the ledger yesterday afternoon for safekeeping, saying the parish was a quieter place than Harcourt's cottage. And now it has vanished." The inspector was already there, his mustache bristling furiously, his boots pacing back and forth across the carpet. "Forced entry at the window," he said tersely, pointing to the latch, which hung broken. The thief knew what he wanted. Straight for the desk, straight for the ledger. Nothing else was touched. The villagers who had crowded into the hall murmured darkly. The ledger, long whispered to contain secrets, had become a spectre over the village. Some claimed it held evidence of debts, unpaid. Others whispered of criminal dealings far beyond their quiet lanes. Now, with its disappearance, suspicion thickened like fog. Miss Marple, standing quietly by the hearth, looked not at the window but at the scattered papers. She bent delicately, retrieving one sheet that had fallen beneath the desk. The ink was smudged, but she could still make out Harcourt's neat handwriting. It was a list of names, each followed by precise figures. She held it up, her mild voice carrying clearly. "It seems Mr. Harcourt was in the habit of keeping careful accounts, debts perhaps for loans. Such things, you know, can bind people together most unpleasantly." Inspector Graves snatched the paper, scanning it with narrowed eyes. "Names from the village," he muttered. "Clement, Hartnell, Phelps." He stopped abruptly, folding the sheet with unnecessary force. The vicar flushed crimson. Surely it cannot mean surely not debts. My dear, it must be some other record. But the murmurs in the room grew sharper. If Harcourt had kept ledgers of debts, then many in the village might have reason to silence him. Miss Marple's gaze swept the gathering. She noticed Mrs. Hartnell stiffen when her name was read, her lips pursed tightly. Mr. Phelps, the organist, dabbed at his brow with a handkerchief, though the room was not overly warm, and Henry Finch, hovering near the back, looked as though the ground beneath him might give way. Perhaps, Miss Marple said gently, the question is not only who owes, but what might happen should those debts become known to others. Pride, my dear Inspector, is often as dangerous a motive as greed. The inspector harumphed, clearly impatient with her riddles. We'll search the village at once. Whoever stole the ledger cannot have gone far. But the search yielded nothing. No trace of the ledger appeared in the hedgerow, lane, or cottage. It had vanished as thoroughly as Mrs. Finch herself. That night, Miss Marple returned to her own cottage. She lit her lamp and sat down with her knitting, though the needles scarcely moved. Her thoughts wandered over the day's events. The missing page, the vanished housekeeper, the cigarette at the mill, the clasp buried in the vicarage garden, and now the ledger, stolen from beneath the very nose of the law. She considered the psychology of it. Whoever had taken the ledger was not merely concealing evidence. They were controlling it. To remove it from the vicarage study was a message that they held the power to shape suspicion, to decide who should be ruined or spared. Her reverie was broken by a knock at her door. When she opened it, she found Henry Finch standing there, pale and trembling. "Miss Marple," he said in a low voice, "I must speak with you. I know how it looks, with Aunt missing and now the ledger gone. But I swear I had nothing to do with either. I came because there's something I saw that night, and I can't keep it to myself any longer." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind sharpened. She ushered him inside with a nod. "It's best you tell me everything, my dear. Half-truths, you see, are like weeds. They grow until they choke out the flowers." Henry swallowed hard. "It was the night Mr. Harcourt died. I passed by his cottage late, and I saw someone leaving. Not Aunt, not anyone from the village, a tall man, wearing a dark coat. He lit a cigarette as he walked away. I didn't see his face, but I'll never forget the glow of that match." Miss Marple folded her hands. So there it was, the shadowy figure, confirmed. A man who smoked, who moved with purpose, and who had reason to fear what Mr. Harcourt's ledger contained. She glanced at Henry, her voice kind. "You did well to speak now, but you must be prepared. Truth has a way of stirring more than it soothes." Even as she spoke, the church bell struck midnight, and from the lane outside came the sound of hurried footsteps fading into the dark. The following morning dawned clear, though the mood in St. Mary Mead was anything but. Rumors had spread swiftly after Henry Finch's late-night confession to Miss Marple, though she herself had shared nothing. Villagers had a way of sensing when secrets stirred beneath the surface, and soon whispers of a tall man in a dark coat passed from lip to lip as if the figure had been glimpsed by everyone. Inspector Graves, grim and weary, stood outside the vicarage addressing a knot of villagers. "There is no proof of any stranger," he declared, his voice carrying across the green. "We will continue to question those with the clearest connection. Henry Finch was among them." Henry, who lingered nearby, shifted uneasily under the weight of accusing stares. His shoulders sagged, his jaw tight, though he spoke no word in his defense. Miss Marple, seated quietly on a bench with her knitting, observed the inspector with mild patience. She knew his method: fix on the most obvious suspect, press hard, and hope for cracks. It sometimes worked, but more often it left the true culprit free to maneuver unseen. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took her customary walk through the high street. At the post office, Mrs. Brimley leaned across the counter to whisper, Mark my words, Miss Marple. It was that stranger who killed Harcourt. A tall fellow, dangerous-looking, they say. And wasn't there a foreigner seen at the inn 2 weeks ago? A travelling salesman, so he called himself. Miss Marple smiled politely, offering no comment, but she filed the details away. Salesmen did pass through, often unnoticed. Yet in her long years, she had learned that those who called themselves salesmen often carried goods more costly than trinkets. She continued on to the inn itself, where she found Mr. Groves, the innkeeper, polishing glasses behind the counter. The room was quiet, the scent of stale smoke clinging to the beams overhead. "A busy fortnight for you, Mr. Groves?" she asked, her tone light as if discussing the weather. He looked up, startled, before recovering. "A fair few travellers, ma'am. It is always in autumn. Commercial folk, mostly." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the ashtray at the far table where a cigarette butt smouldered faintly, abandoned only moments before. "I wonder," she said gently, "if one of those commercial gentlemen happened to favour a strong tobacco blend. One notices the scent. Very distinctive. Balkan, I believe." Groves hesitated before nodding. "There was one, yes. Stayed only a night. Tall chap, dark coat, sharp eyes. Paid in cash. Didn't give much name. Left before breakfast. Couldn't say where to." Her eyes twinkled. "How very curious. And he left behind no trace, save perhaps a scent that lingers longer than footsteps." That evening, Miss Marple joined the Clements for supper. The vicar, still shaken by the break-in, lamented the gossip spiraling through the village. "We are Christians, yet we fall into suspicion and fear. My dear, you cannot truly think the stranger is to blame. Surely the culprit lies closer to home." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "One must never dismiss the stranger, Reverend. Villages are like gardens. Every so often, a weed from beyond takes root. Yet one must also recall that weeds flourish best where the soil has already been disturbed." Mrs. Clement shivered at her words. "Then you believe the stranger and someone from the village may both be involved?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. She had seen enough of human nature to know that conspiracies were seldom tidy affairs. As the meal ended, a knock came at the vicarage door. It was Mr. Phelps, the organist, flustered and pale. "Inspector Graves. Quickly. There's smoke coming from Harcourt's cottage." The villagers rushed into the lane, lanterns swinging. Indeed, a thin plume of smoke curled from the library window of the dead collector's home. When the inspector forced the door, they found a small fire smouldering in the grate. It had been set deliberately, for the ashes within were not of wood alone, but of paper scraps of neat handwriting blackened and curling to dust. "The ledger," Graves muttered, stamping furiously at the embers. "Someone tried to burn it." Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes falling on a half-charred scrap that had escaped the flames. She lifted it delicately with the tongs. The name scrawled across it was still visible. Phelps. The organist gave a strangled cry and staggered back, his face drained of all color. The atmosphere inside Harcourt's cottage grew heavy with suspicion. Villagers pressed forward, whispering fiercely, their eyes fixed on the pale figure of Mr. Phelps, who stood trembling by the door. The charred fragment bearing his name lay on the hearth rug, stark evidence against him. Inspector Graves wasted no time. "Well, Phelps? Care to explain why your name appears in Harcourt's ledger? Or why did someone try to burn it?" His voice was sharp, each word echoing in the uneasy silence. Phelps swallowed hard, his hands twisting the brim of his hat. "I don't know. I swear I don't. I never owed Harcourt anything, never borrowed a penny in my life." The villagers muttered doubtfully. Harcourt's reputation for meticulous record-keeping was legendary. If a name appeared in his ledger, it was for a reason. Miss Marple stood a little apart, her knitting in hand, though she had not cast a single stitch since the fire was found. Her calm blue eyes studied the organist with gentle curiosity. "You say you never owed money, Mr. Phelps, yet sometimes debts are not merely coins. A man may owe favors or secrets. Did Mr. Harcourt know something you wished kept quiet?" The organist's face darkened with sudden color. "That's nonsense. Pure gossip. I've nothing to hide." But the way his voice cracked and the way his eyes darted toward the window told a different story. Inspector Graves pressed on. "You were seen, Phelps, loitering near this very cottage days before Harcourt's death. Witnesses place you here. Did you come to plead with him, to silence him? I came only to collect a hymn book he had borrowed." Phelps cried, though his tone lacked conviction. "Ask anyone I lent it to weeks ago." The inspector snorted. "Convenient tale." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her voice mild. "A hymn book, perhaps. Yet if so, where is it now? Books rarely vanish without leaving their dust behind. And one cannot help noticing, Mr. Phelps, how very nervous you grow when questions of debt arise." The villagers leaned closer, their curiosity sharpened. Phelps sputtered a denial, but his protest only deepened their doubt. At length, Inspector Graves dismissed the crowd, warning Phelps that he would be called for further questioning. The organist stumbled away, his steps uneven, his shoulders bowed under the weight of suspicion. Later that evening, Miss Marple strolled through the green, pausing at the gate of the church. Inside, faint notes drifted from the hesitant organ, broken chords, as if the player's mind were elsewhere. She slipped quietly into the pews, unnoticed at first, and watched as Phelps sat slumped over the keys, his fingers pressing sound without music. After a time she rose, her step light but deliberate, and approached. "A troubled conscience rarely makes for harmonious sound," she observed gently. Phelps started, turning sharply. "Miss Marple, too, did not hear you come in." She smiled faintly. "Few do, when they are so wrapped in their own thoughts." He tried to compose himself, but his hands shook against the keys. At last, he whispered, "I did borrow money. Years ago, Harcourt lent it just a small sum, but he never let me forget it. He threatened to tell the whole parish if I did not pay with interest. I swore I'd repay it, but the figure grew larger with every month. I was desperate." Miss Marple's voice was kind, yet firm. "And so you feared the ledger. Once your name was written, you could not escape. That is why you lingered near his cottage, did you not?" He nodded miserably. "Yes, but I didn't kill him. I didn't, and I didn't steal the ledger. I swear it." Miss Marple studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. At last she said, "I believe you, Mr. Phelps. But desperation makes men careless. Someone else knew of your debt. Someone who wished to make you the scapegoat." As she left the church, the night air pressed cool against her cheeks. The puzzle was tightening, the pieces falling into sharper outline. Someone had planted suspicion on Henry Finch. Someone had planted the clasp in the vicarage garden, and now someone had tried to plant guilt upon the organist. Her eyes glimmered as she walked home under the moonlight. "A clever hand at work," she murmured. "One who knows the value of gossip as well as the weight of a ledger. But clever hands, like careless tongues, always slip in the end." Just as she reached her gate, she paused. A figure moved quickly across the lane, slipping into shadow. A match flared briefly, then died, leaving only the lingering scent of strong tobacco drifting on the night air. The morning after her moonlit encounter with the shadowy smoker, Miss Marple set about her most reliable method of inquiry. Not force, not confrontation, but conversation. In St. Mary Mead, people revealed themselves most fully when they thought they were merely gossiping over tea. She began at Mrs. Brimley's shop, her basket neatly tucked under her arm. The bell jingled as she entered, and Mrs. Price Ridley was already there, leaning against the counter with the self-importance of one dispensing news. "Well, Miss Marple," she began, her voice carrying across the room, I suppose you've heard. They say the inspector has enough to put Phelps in jail, and about time, too. Such men ought not to hold church keys, much less play the organ." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Ah, but one must be careful with such conclusions, dear Mrs. Price Ridley. Many cats have been scolded for stealing cream, when in fact it was the dog who tipped the jug." Mrs. Brimley chuckled behind the counter, but Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "You'll see. The man is guilty." Miss Marple only nodded, her eyes bright. She had noted the satisfaction in Price Ridley's voice, not mere fear, but relish. It was always useful to see who enjoyed the ruin of others. From the shop she walked toward the inn. Mr. Groves greeted her with a wary glance, polishing a glass as if it were a shield. The smell of tobacco still clung to the rafters. "Mr. Groves," Miss Marple said gently, "I was reflecting on your guest, the tall gentleman in the dark coat. Did he by any chance leave an address or mention an acquaintance in the village?" The innkeeper hesitated, his hand pausing on the glass. "No, ma'am. Not that I recall. Paid his bill and was off." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And yet he favored a particular tobacco. One notices such things. A Balkan blend, quite uncommon here. Surely he must have purchased it nearby." Groves shifted uncomfortably, perhaps from the tobacconist in Market Harborough. Couldn't say. Her smile deepened. "Quite so? Still, I do wonder if such a man came only for one night, what business would draw him to a quiet village like ours?" The innkeeper's eyes flickered. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, muttering something about deliveries. Miss Marple left him to his unease, her mind already noting the cracks in his account. That afternoon, she paid a call at the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement poured tea with trembling hands. "I cannot endure it, Miss Marple. The whispers, the suspicions. It seems everyone is accused in turn. Yesterday Henry, today Mr. Phelps. Who will it be tomorrow?" Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Fear spreads quickly, my dear. Like ivy, once it takes hold, it covers all. Yet ivy only clings where there is weakness in the stone beneath." The vicar frowned. "And you believe there is weakness here in our parish?" "There is weakness everywhere," Miss Marple said gently. "It is the nature of humanity. The question is only who seeks to exploit it." Their talk was interrupted by Inspector Graves, striding into the room with all the authority of the law. He addressed Miss Marple directly. "You seem to have the ear of this village, madam. Perhaps you can explain why half of them are now speaking of a stranger with a cigarette, when I have found no trace of such a man." Miss Marple's smile was as mild as ever. "Because, Inspector, the village notices small things, the flare of a match, and the scent of smoke upon the air, and such small things, though easily dismissed, are often truer than grand theories." He scowled, unconvinced. "Until I see him with my own eyes, I'll not waste time chasing phantoms." "Ah," Miss Marple replied softly. "But phantoms have a way of revealing themselves when one least expects it. One must only wait and ask the right questions." That evening she put her words into practice. She invited Henry Finch for tea as promised. He sat stiffly at her table, his cup untouched. "I know they suspect me," he muttered. "But I didn't harm Aunt, and I didn't touch that ledger." Miss Marple's gaze was kindly. "I believe you, but tell me, Henry, when you saw the stranger that night, did he look toward the vicarage as he left Harcourt's cottage?" Henry hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I thought it odd at the time, as though he knew where he was going." Miss Marple folded her hands. The pieces were falling into place. A stranger in the village, a ledger stolen from the vicarage, and a trail of suspicion carefully planted on those least able to defend themselves. It was a clever design, but she had seen such designs before. As Henry rose to leave, she added gently, "Remember, my dear, the truth will always come out. But, until then, silence may be your safest ally." When the door closed, she returned to her chair, her knitting untouched, her eyes fixed on the darkening lane outside. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, the true hand behind the conspiracy moved still unseen. But not for long. And as the church bell struck 8, a faint glow appeared down the lane, a match flaring briefly, followed by the unmistakable curl of tobacco smoke drifting toward her gate. The next day broke with a pale sun over St. Mary Mead, but its light did little to warm the chill that had settled over the village. Doors were shut more firmly, curtains drawn a little tighter, and neighbors greeted each other with caution rather than cheer. The death of Mr. Harcourt and the disappearance of his housekeeper had become more than tragedy. They were a shadow stretching over every cottage. Miss Marple, however, began her morning as always, neat as a pin, her knitting basket at hand. Yet today she was not content to observe from her window. She meant to stir the waters, for in her long life she had found that people, like ponds, often revealed what lay beneath when disturbed just enough. Her first call was at Mrs. Hartnell's, where the curtains were drawn back only halfway. The lady opened the door with a suspicious look, but ushered Miss Marple out of habit. Tea was served, though hastily, and Miss Marple settled herself comfortably. "I was thinking," she said mildly, "of the dreadful state of the vicarage garden. To find Mrs. Finch's clasp buried there makes one quite uneasy, does it not?" Mrs. Hartnell sniffed. "Uneasy? It's scandalous. Imagine the shame upon the parish if it were true she'd been, well, you know, disposed of there. Poor Mrs. Clement, what humiliation." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed softly, "and yet I wonder who might have known enough of the garden's habits to choose such a spot. Someone who had been near, perhaps even often. One forgets how much a garden reveals to those who look." For a fleeting second, Mrs. Hartnell's eyes darted away, her lips tightening before she regained composure. Miss Marple noted it, but made no comment. Instead, she spoke cheerfully of chrysanthemums until her visit ended. From there she walked to the High Street, where she encountered Mr. Phelps, the organist, standing outside the church. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. "A fine day for practice," Miss Marple said pleasantly, nodding toward the church door. He gave a hollow laugh. "Practice? With the whole village whispering about me? I could scarcely strike a note without thinking of their eyes on my back." Miss Marple clucked sympathetically. "Yes, gossip is a cruel master. Still, I imagine you must be relieved the ledger itself has not reappeared. Once ash, always ash, as they say. Except, of course, when fragments remain." The man flinched visibly, his hand tightening on the church rail. "You kept one of those scraps?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Why, yes. I always save what others overlook. It is remarkable how often such trifles tell the larger tale." He paled further, but said no more, excusing himself into the church. Miss Marple let him go, content with the small crack his words had revealed. In the afternoon, she paused at the inn once more. Mr. Groves greeted her stiffly, though his eyes betrayed nervousness. A few men lingered with pints, but the room was quiet. Miss Marple ordered tea and sat by the hearth. Casually, she remarked, "So troublesome, these strangers. One never quite knows their purpose. Why, even a single night's stay can alter the course of a whole village, don't you think?" Groves muttered. "Aye, well, it's none of my concern once they've paid." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Of course. Though it is odd, is it not, that a man should pay in cash for such a short visit and yet smoke so costly a tobacco? It does rather suggest he came with business already in mind, not merely passing through." The innkeeper's hand slipped, nearly dropping the glass he held. He covered quickly, but Miss Marple had seen enough. She did not press further, only sipped her tea with apparent contentment. That evening she returned to her own cottage, her thoughts turning like threads weaving a pattern. Mrs. Hartnell's nervous glance, Phelps's startled slip, and Groves's trembling hand were all small things, yet together they formed a net tightening around the truth. She reflected, as she often did, on the nature of deception. One may plant evidence, one may spread rumors, but the tongue betrays itself when pressed lightly, she murmured to herself. Just as she was setting aside her knitting, there came a knock at her door. When she opened it, Henry Finch stood there once again, but this time his expression was not merely anxious. It was frightened. "Miss Marple," he whispered, "you must help me. I've just found something in Aunt's old trunk, and if I'm right, it means she knew about the ledger all along." His voice shook, and in his hand he clutched a folded slip of paper, worn and creased as if hidden for years. Henry Finch's hand trembled as he unfolded the worn scrap of paper. Miss Marple, calm as ever, ushered him into her parlor and set a pot of tea on the table. She allowed him a moment to steady himself before speaking. "Now, Henry," she said gently, "tell me plainly, what is this paper you have found?" He swallowed, his voice unsteady. It was hidden in Aunt's trunk beneath the lining. I was sorting through her things, hoping for some clue where she might have gone. And there it was. I think she must have hidden it long ago. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes bright. The paper was yellowed at the edges, the ink faint but legible. Across the top, in Harcourt's neat, unmistakable hand, were columns of names and numbers, yet these were not the same as the page she had glimpsed in the library. These were more private, and at the bottom was a signature, Mrs. Finch. Henry's voice cracked. "It looks like she borrowed money too. But there are notes in her own hand, little notations about people paying in cash, about debts being called in. She must have been helping him keep the records." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, housekeepers often know more of their master's affairs than anyone suspects. She may well have acted as his assistant, or perhaps as a shield. That would explain her disappearance. If she feared what might come to light, she might have tried to hide herself, or someone else may have silenced her for knowing too much." Henry buried his face in his hands. "And now everyone thinks I'm guilty. If they see this paper, they'll say she and I conspired together." Miss Marple's voice was firm, though kind. "Not if the truth is spoken carefully. The key, Henry, is not only in what is revealed, but also in when. Timing, you see, can be as powerful as any alibi." At that moment a knock rattled the door, and Inspector Graves entered without waiting for an answer. His mustache bristled as he eyed the scene. "So, young Finch has run here for comfort. What are you doing there?" Henry flinched, but Miss Marple, with her usual composure, folded the paper into her knitting basket. "Merely an old scrap from Mrs. Finch's belongings," she said mildly. "Of a domestic nature, hardly relevant to the matter at hand." The inspector's eyes narrowed. "Everything is relevant until I say otherwise. And you, madam, must not conceal evidence." Miss Marple met his gaze serenely. "I should hardly dream of it, Inspector. I'm only suggesting that evidence must be considered in the proper context. To leap upon scraps without reflection is rather like judging a cake by its crumbs." Graves harumphed, clearly frustrated. "Well, I've more pressing matters. The stranger was seen again last night at the edge of the lane by the mill. Vanished before my men could reach him." Miss Marple's brows rose ever so slightly. "Ah, a man who appears only in shadow, yet always near where trouble brews. How very deliberate." The inspector muttered something about doubling the watch and stomped out, leaving a silence heavy with tension. Henry whispered, "He'll ruin me." If he finds that paper, Miss Marple placed a steady hand on his arm. "Courage, Henry. Sometimes the best way to protect the innocent is to let suspicion ripen until the guilty can no longer bear its weight. People, you know, are very like fruit in that regard. They seem firm, but one small press and the bruise appears." That evening, Miss Marple walked alone toward the vicarage, the paper now carefully tucked away. The lanes were quiet, the windows shuttered. Yet as she passed the green, she paused. A figure moved at the far end, tall, with a coat collar turned up against the chill. A match flared briefly, illuminating the harsh lines of a stranger's face before the glow vanished into darkness. She did not call out. Instead, she returned home with calm steps, her mind sharper than ever. The stranger was real, of that there could be no doubt, but he was not working alone. His movements were too certain, his knowledge of the village too precise. Seated by her lamp, Miss Marple drew the scrap of paper once more from her basket and studied it carefully. One note in Mrs. Finch's hand caught her attention, a line scrawled faintly at the margin. "Ledger holds more than debts. Names dangerous if spoken." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the words. The ledger was not merely a record of borrowed shillings and pounds. It was a map of secrets, binding villagers and strangers alike. She set down the paper with a quiet sigh. "Yes," she murmured, "the noose tightens. And when it does, someone will pull too hard and betray themselves." At that moment, the church bell rang 9, and in the stillness that followed, a sudden cry echoed faintly from the direction of the inner cry that shattered the night and brought villagers running once more into the dark. The villagers reached the inn in a rush, lanterns bobbing in the night air, voices sharp with alarm. The cry that had pierced the stillness came from within, and when the door was flung open, Mr. Groves, the innkeeper, was found pale and shaken behind the counter. "It was the stranger," he gasped, pointing toward the back door that banged lightly on its hinges. He was here, standing no more than a few feet from me. Asked for a drink, bold as you like, and when I turned to fetch it, he was gone. Then something smashed in the kitchen. I thought I was alone, but there was someone else. The villagers crowded inside, their whispers filling the room like a rising tide. On the floor of the kitchen lay a shattered jug, its contents spilled across the flagstones. But what drew every eye was the small, leather-bound book half hidden beneath the broken pottery. Inspector Graves was the first to snatch it up. His face reddened as he turned the cover. "A ledger," he muttered. "Harcourt's ledger. The very thing stolen from the vicarage." Gasps rippled through the crowd. But as he flipped the pages, his expression hardened. Whole sections had been torn out. What remained was incomplete, a skeleton of accounts. Miss Marple, standing quietly near the hearth, spoke in her mild way. "Curious, is it not, that the stranger should leave it here so clumsily? One wonders, did he mean to lose it, or was he interrupted?" Mr. Groves dabbed his brow with a handkerchief. "He could have killed me, standing so close." But instead he fled. "Why?" Inspector Graves barked, "because he knew I'd have men patrolling." He panicked, that's the answer. But Miss Marple shook her head. Panicked men do not leave behind the very thing they sought. "No, Inspector, I fear this was deliberate. A piece of theater designed to make us believe we are closer to the truth than we are." The villagers muttered uneasily. To think the stranger had stood among them, bold enough to step inside the inn, chilled them more than the night air outside. Later, when the crowd had dispersed, Miss Marple lingered near the bar. Her eyes rested on the ashtray, where a cigarette butt still smoldered. She bent delicately, examining the paper. It was the same Balkan blend, strong and rare. Yet what caught her notice was the way the ash had been tapped carefully to one side as if by habit. "Men," she murmured softly, "may change their names and their coats, but seldom their habits." She slipped the stub into her handkerchief and left the inn. The next morning, the village buzzed like a disturbed hive. Some were certain the ledger's reappearance meant the mystery was near its end. Others swore it proved the stranger was still playing them for fools. At the church hall, Miss Marple took her seat for the Women's Guild meeting, her knitting once again in hand. But as the women spoke of sewing patterns and bazaars, her eyes lingered on Mrs. Hartnell, who fidgeted more than usual. When someone mentioned Harcourt's accounts, Mrs. Hartnell snapped so sharply that the whole room fell silent. Miss Marple only smiled faintly, as though nothing were amiss. Later she stopped by the church, where Mr. Phelps was rehearsing hymns. His hands stumbled over the keys, producing sour notes. When he saw Miss Marple, he flushed. "You've heard, I suppose," he muttered, "about the ledger being found." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice calm, "though it is not so much what is found that interests me, but what is missing. Those torn pages must have contained something very important indeed." Phelps paled, his fingers tightening on the keys. "You think I tore them out?" "I think," Miss Marple replied gently, "that whoever removed them knew their value. And when a man trembles at the mention of missing pages, one may suspect he knows more than he cares to admit." He turned away, striking the keys too harshly, and Miss Marple let the discordant notes linger in the air. That evening, she sat by her fire, reflecting. The stranger had revealed himself boldly, yet the true hand remained hidden in the village. The reappearance of the ledger was not an end, but another stage in the performance. She thought again of Mrs. Finch's note, of names dangerous if spoken, and of the pattern of planted evidence. Her eyes sharpened. "Yes," she murmured, "it is a clever design. But cleverness is a veil, and veils always slip when one tugs gently enough." At that very moment, a knock sounded at her door. When she opened it, Mrs. Clement stood there, pale and distraught. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "there's been another disappearance. Mr. Groves, the innkeeper, he's gone." The news of Mr. Groves' disappearance sent a fresh wave of alarm rippling through St. Mary Mead. The villagers, already unsettled by the stranger's bold appearance and the re-emergence of the ledger, now felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. To lose a man so suddenly, and one who had stood at the very center of events, was a blow that left the parish rattled. Inspector Graves marched into the inn that same morning, barking orders to his men to search the premises. The bar was deserted, the rooms upstairs neatly made. Only in the small back office did they find something out of place. A chair overturned, a drawer left open, and on the floor a crushed cigarette butt of the same Balkan blend. Graves held it up with a grim scowl. The stranger again. He must have forced Groves away, maybe to silence him. But Miss Marple, who had quietly followed into the office, looked at the ash with her usual mild expression. "Perhaps," she said softly, "though it does seem curious that so rare a tobacco should leave its trace at every scene. It is almost as though it is being shown to us deliberately." The inspector gave a short laugh. "Shown to us? You mean someone wants us to see it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Why, yes, Inspector. A trail that is too perfect is rarely the truth. In the garden, by the mill, here at the inn, it is all very neat. Too neat." The villagers, gathered at the door, murmured at this. But Graves brushed it aside, ordering a wider search. That afternoon, Miss Marple took her customary walk, her steps slow but steady. She paused by the churchyard where Mrs. Hartnell was arranging flowers at a grave. The woman started when Miss Marple greeted her, dropping a posy of chrysanthemums. "My dear, how clumsy of me," Mrs. Hartnell muttered, gathering them hastily. Miss Marple's tone was gentle, almost conversational. "Such dreadful business about Mr. Groves. One wonders why he should vanish when he had so much yet to tell. I suppose he did speak with you, Mrs. Hartnell. He was such a talkative man." Mrs. Hartnell stiffened. He said nothing of consequence. Nothing at all. Miss Marple's gaze was steady, though her words were mild. "Indeed. I always think it is difficult for an innkeeper to say nothing. They collect confidences as naturally as bees collect pollen." For a moment, Mrs. Hartnell's lips parted, as though she might protest, but she turned quickly away, her cheeks flushed. Later, Miss Marple stopped by the vicarage. Mrs. Clement was there, flustered as ever, her hands busy with teacups she scarcely set down before lifting again. "Oh, Miss Marple, do you think we shall ever have peace again? People vanish, names appear in ledgers, and now poor Mr. Groves is gone without a trace." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Peace will return, my dear. But the first truth must be uncovered. And truth is often hidden in the smallest of slips. Words, actions, and habits betray far more than grand gestures." That evening, Inspector Graves called a meeting at the church hall, determined to rally the village and steady the tide of panic. The hall filled with anxious faces, each watching their neighbor with suspicion. Graves declared that the stranger must be hunted, that Grove's disappearance was proof of his guilt. But Miss Marple, seated quietly at the back with her knitting, rose when the inspector paused for breath. Her voice, though mild, carried clearly across the hall. "I wonder," she said, "if we are not too quick to blame the stranger for every evil. After all, who here knows him? We have only glimpses, shadows, and a scent of smoke, and yet we speak of him as though he walked among us daily. Could it be, perhaps, that the true hand guiding these events belongs to someone closer, someone who knows our habits, our fears, and our gossip as well as we know them ourselves?" A hush fell over the room. Faces turned, some with defiance, others with unease. Phelps shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mrs. Hartnell stared straight ahead, her lips pressed tight. Henry Finch leaned forward, as though clinging to her every word. The inspector frowned, clearly irritated. "Are you suggesting, Miss Marple, that we look among ourselves rather than chase the stranger?" Her smile was faint, almost apologetic. "I'm suggesting only that a weed rarely thrives in a garden unless the soil welcomes it. The stranger may have come, yes, but he was aided by that, I'm quite certain, and it is in this hall, perhaps, that the answers lie." The room erupted in whispers. Miss Marple sat back down, her needles resuming their gentle click. Outwardly serene, her mind was sharper than ever. The time was drawing near. One more slip, one more revelation, and the veil would be torn away. As the meeting broke apart, a sudden commotion arose near the door. A boy burst in, breathless, his face white with fear. "They've found something," he cried. "In the woods by the mill, a spade and a body." The villagers followed the boy's trembling lead to the woods by the mill, their lanterns flickering against the dark branches. The air was damp and heavy, and even the owls seemed to fall silent as the party pushed through brambles to the clearing he pointed out. There, half concealed beneath hurriedly turned earth, lay the grim shape of a body. A spade stood thrust upright in the soil, its handle glistening with dew. The constables moved forward under Inspector Graves' barked orders, clearing the earth until the body was fully revealed. Gasps and cries broke from the crowd. It was Mrs. Finch. Her face, pale and drawn, bore no marks of violence, but her shawl was wrapped tightly around her shoulders as though clutched in her final moments. The clasp, long missing, was gone entirely. Inspector Graves straightened, his expression stern. The missing housekeeper, at last. Murdered, without a doubt. And with this spade from the vicarage shed, we have proof the deed was done close to home. The villagers broke into frantic whispers. Suspicion darted like quick shadows from one face to another. Some glanced at Henry Finch, who stood frozen, horror in his eyes. Others whispered of Phelps or even Mr. Groves, who had vanished so conveniently. Miss Marple, standing with her walking stick, gazed at the scene without an outward alarm. Her eyes lingered not on the body, but on the spade. Its blade was darkened with soil that was damp and clinging, quite unlike the light, sandy earth of the vicarage garden. She noted this, storing the thought away. The body was carried back to the village in a solemn procession. At the church hall, villagers gathered once more, their faces pale and voices hushed. The grim discovery had driven all speculation into sharper focus. Inspector Graves addressed them firmly. "We know now the stranger has turned to murder. He must be found and brought to justice. But I also mean to question those in this village who may have aided him. The ledger proves Harcourt kept accounts of many here. Debts are motive enough for betrayal." Miss Marple, seated quietly, let her needles click while the villagers spoke. One by one names were muttered: Phelps, Hartnell, Finch. Each defended themselves in hurried tones. The air grew thick with accusation. Then Miss Marple lifted her head, her voice clear though mild. "It seems to me, my dear, that we are chasing smoke and shadows. The stranger may indeed be guilty of many things, but Mrs. Finch's body tells us more than we think. For you see, she did not flee. She was silenced, and the hand that silenced her was one that knew her well, all eyes turned toward her. She continued with calm precision, as though explaining a simple knitting pattern. The spade may have come from the vicarage shed, but the soil upon it tells another tale. Not from the garden, no. From the mill path, where the earth is damp and heavy. Whoever buried her there carried the tool with purpose, and whoever planted her clasp in the vicarage garden wished to mislead us." A ripple of unease swept through the hall. Mrs. Hartnell shifted in her seat. Phelps dabbed at his brow again. Henry Finch stared at the floor, his jaw tight. Inspector Graves frowned. "Are you suggesting one of these people buried her?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "I'm suggesting only that the truth lies not with a stranger who appears like a phantom, but with someone who knows how to turn our fears against us. The ledger was never about money alone. It was about secrets, and secrets are far more deadly than coins." The hall fell silent. Outside, the church bell struck, its echoes rolling through the still night. Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly, her voice quiet but resolute. "We must gather all those touched by Harcourt's records, for only then will the truth show itself. Pride, fear, and guilt will do the work for us if we listen closely." The inspector bristled, but even he saw the sense in her words. A meeting was arranged for the following evening, with every name from Harcourt's ledger summoned to the vicarage drawing-room. As the villagers filed out, Miss Marple remained seated, her eyes distant. She had seen the pattern now, though the final stitch was not yet tied. Someone among them had killed Harcourt, silenced Mrs. Finch, and sought to burn the ledger. Someone clever, yes, but not clever enough to escape the quiet patience of an old woman with knitting needles. When she rose to leave, Henry Finch approached her, his face pale. "Miss Marple, do you truly believe the murderer will be at that gathering?" She gave him a gentle smile. "My dear boy, the murderer will have no choice. For secrets, like debts, must always be paid in full." The vicarage drawing-room had never held such a tense assembly. Lamps glowed softly against the heavy curtains, their light falling on faces drawn tight with fear, resentment, and fatigue. One by one, the names from Harcourt's ledger had been summoned. Henry Finch, pale and restless. Mr. Phelps, the organist, wiping his brow despite the chill. Mrs. Hartnell, stiff-backed and defensive, and others who had been whispered about in the weeks since Harcourt's death. Even Inspector Graves stood near the hearth, his arms folded, his mustache bristling with impatience. Miss Marple sat in her usual chair, her knitting basket at her side, though the needles remained still. Her eyes, bright and deceptively mild, moved from one face to the next. She had seen such gatherings before when suspicion ripened into truth, and truth slipped from trembling lips like water from a cracked jug. The vicar opened with solemn words, asking for calm and truth. But it was Miss Marple who took control with a gentle cough. "It seems to me," she said softly, "that we are all gathered here because of one man's habit of writing things down. Poor Mr. Harcourt. His ledger recorded more than pounds and shillings. It recorded pride, weakness, and folly. Such things, you know, are far more dangerous than money." The room stirred uneasily. Phelps shifted, Mrs. Hartnell frowned, and Henry Finch stared at the floor. Miss Marple continued. Now, what interests me most is not the debts themselves, but the pattern of what has followed. A missing page, a vanished housekeeper, a clasp planted in the vicarage garden, and a stranger who smokes a very particular type of tobacco. Too neat, don't you think? A little like a play performed for our benefit. Inspector Graves huffed. Are you saying none of this is real? Oh, it is real enough, Miss Marple said kindly. A woman lies dead, a man is murdered, and papers are burned. But the neatness is the clue. It is too carefully arranged to be coincidence. Someone wished us to look in every direction but the right one. Her gaze fell on Mrs. Hartnell, who bristled. Why look at me? I've nothing to do with this. If my name was in that wretched book, it was an error. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Ah, but you flinched, dear, when first the ledger was mentioned, and you snapped when gossip touched on debts. Such little signs are telling. A guilty conscience, like a crack in porcelain, may be hidden under glaze, but it is there all the same. Mrs. Hartnell flushed crimson but said nothing. Next, Miss Marple turned to Phelps. And you, Mr. Phelps? You spoke too quickly of the burned ledger, as though you knew what was lost before anyone else had seen it. That is a dangerous habit, to know more than one ought. The organist stammered, his handkerchief twisting in his hands. I was only guessing. Everyone knew my name was in it. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. But not everyone knew which pages had been torn. That was knowledge held by very few indeed. The inspector's eyes sharpened, but Miss Marple raised a hand. Patience, Inspector. The truth will show itself in time, for I believe Mrs. Finch knew too much. She helped Harcourt with his records, and when she saw the stranger in the village likely brought her as a mask, she understood what was coming. Poor soul, she did not run far enough. The room was silent now, every breath heavy. Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her voice quiet but firm. We are dealing with a conspiracy, yes, but conspiracies always falter when one mind tries to be too clever. Evidence planted, suspicions scattered, names whispered, it was meant to confuse us. Yet in truth it narrows the field, for only someone within this very room could have known when to place each piece so neatly. The words hung in the air like a tightening noose. Henry Finch glanced up, his eyes wide with fear. Phelps sat rigid, his face pale. Mrs. Hartnell opened her mouth as though to speak, then pressed her lips shut again. Miss Marple's needles clicked once, then stopped. Tomorrow, she said softly, I shall have one final question, and when it is answered, the murderer will no longer be able to hide. Inspector Graves stepped forward, ready to protest, but the spell of her words was too strong. The villagers shuffled out of the drawing room, whispering furiously, each afraid to meet the other's eye. As the last door closed, Miss Marple remained seated, gazing into the fire. She had tugged at the veil, and it had begun to slip. Tomorrow it will fall entirely. Outside, the wind stirred through the hedges, carrying with it the faintest trace of smoke, sharp, bitter, and familiar. Somewhere close, the hand that had struck down Harcourt and Finch was waiting, restless, knowing the game was nearly over. The next evening, the vicarage drawing-room filled once more. The atmosphere was thicker than before, a cloud of suspicion and dread hanging over the assembled villagers. Each face carried the strain of sleepless nights and gnawing fear. Henry Finch sat hunched in his chair, pale and desperate. Mr. Phelps dabbed his forehead with a trembling handkerchief. Mrs. Hartnell, stiff as a board, looked determined not to betray a flicker of weakness. Inspector Graves stood by the hearth, his arms folded, his gaze sweeping the room. He had agreed reluctantly to allow Miss Marple her way. He knew, though he would never admit it aloud, that her quiet observations had often pierced where his bluster had failed. Miss Marple, small and serene in her chair, folded her hands over her knitting. Her voice was gentle, almost grandmotherly when she began. "We have all been deceived," she said. Deceived most cleverly, I must admit. A stranger with foreign tobacco, glimpsed here and there, planted evidence, a clasp, a spade, and even the ledger itself appearing and disappearing like a conjurer's trick. Each piece is intended to lead us away from the truth. The room stirred uneasily. Miss Marple continued, her eyes twinkling, though her voice remained soft. "But you see, human nature betrays even the cleverest design. A stranger may be conjured from shadows, but habits, those little slips, are harder to disguise. And I have noticed such slips." Her gaze rested on Mr. Phelps, who shifted uncomfortably. "You, for instance, spoke of missing pages before anyone else had seen them. A careless remark, but telling. And Mrs. Hartnell, you flushed and snapped whenever debts were mentioned, as though terrified your pride might be laid bare. Both of you had reason to fear the ledger, yet neither of you planted evidence nor played at the theatre. No one else held that role." She paused, letting the silence settle. Then her eyes moved very slowly to the absent seat at the far end of the room. "We must not forget Mr. Groves, the innkeeper. Or rather, we must recall what is most curious about his disappearance." Gasps rippled through the group. Inspector Graves frowned. "Groves? But he is missing, perhaps even dead." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, Inspector. Mr. Groves is not dead. He has been here all along, appearing and vanishing as he pleased. You see, the stranger was no stranger at all. It was Groves himself in a coat and hat, with the tobacco he favored, playing a part to distract us. Who else had such freedom to come and go, to pay in cash, to linger near the mill or Harcourt's cottage? Who else had access to the inn, where he could claim the phantom had visited and then pretend to vanish himself? It was a trick, my dear, a play performed by a man who thought us too simple to see through the mask." There was a sharp intake of breath. Mrs. Clement covered her mouth with her hand. Phelps muttered a prayer under his breath. Graves barked. "But why? What motive could an innkeeper have for murder?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her words were firm. "Because Harcourt's ledger held his name too. Not for debts of money, but for dealings he dared not have exposed. Smuggling, Inspector. Rare tobacco. Foreign good. She used the inn as a front. Harcourt recorded it all, meticulously. And Mrs. Finch, poor soul, knew of it. She wrote notes in the margins and saw too much, and so she had to be silenced." A hush fell over the room, broken only by the creak of chairs as people shifted uneasily. Miss Marple's voice grew quieter still, yet it carried with piercing clarity. Groves murdered Harcourt to reclaim the ledger. He tore out the most dangerous page, planted evidence to cast suspicion on others, and staged his own disappearance when suspicion drew too near. But he was too clever. The trail of Balkan tobacco and the neatness of the planted clues were all too deliberate. A truly guilty man seeks to hide, not to be seen. Only one who plays in the shadows makes such a show. At that moment, the door creaked open. Groves himself stood there, his coat collar turned high, his face pale and drawn. He had come, perhaps, to hear what was said in his absence. Now, caught in the very act, he froze as every eye turned toward him. Inspector Graves stepped forward with a grim smile. "Well, Groves, do you deny it?" Groves's lips parted, but no words came. His shoulders slumped, his bravado gone. The silence in the room pressed upon him like a weight. Miss Marple, her voice still gentle, spoke the final stitch. "You see, Mr. Groves, the village is not so blind as you hoped. Smoke may cloud the eyes, but in the end it clears, and when it does, the truth stands plain." Groves gave a strangled cry, then buried his face in his hands. The room erupted into whispers, gasps, and the rustle of shifting bodies. Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly, her expression one of quiet sorrow. "Murder," she said softly, "is never as clever as it thinks itself to be."